In the rugged mountains of Ethiopia, where time seems suspended between heaven and earth, lie manuscripts that challenge everything we thought we knew about the last days of humanity. Within the monasteries of Lalibela and Aksum, monks zealously guard ancient parchments written in Ge'ez, the liturgical language that echoes through the centuries, carrying secrets that Rome preferred to see buried forever. These sacred texts narrate a version of the apocalypse that never found a place in the Western canon, a prophetic vision that fundamentally contradicts the one we know through the apocalypse of John. Why does this divergence exist? And what does it reveal about the true origins of Christianity? To understand this question, it is necessary to dive into the turbulent waters of the first Christian centuries, when the faith had not yet been molded by the iron fists of imperial power. Christianity was born as a mosaic of scattered communities, each interpreting the message of Christ through the lenses of its own cultural and spiritual experience. There was no single authorized version of the Gospels, nor a single vision of the end times. Diverse apocalyptic texts circulated freely among the faithful, each offering its own perspective on the final destiny of creation. Among these writings, the Apocalypse of Peter stands out, a second-century work that achieved great popularity in the Eastern and African Christian communities. This ancient text, which predated many later canonical decisions, presented a radically different cosmology from the one that would later be consecrated by the Roman Church. While the Apocalypse of John reflected the political tensions of its time, loaded with symbolisms that mirrored the conflict between the first Christians and the Roman Empire, the Apocalypse of Peter offered a more universal and spiritually focused vision of the final judgment. In the Ethiopian tradition, this text not only survived the persecutions and the conciliar decisions that excluded it from the Western canon, but was elevated to the status of canonical scripture, thus preserving a window into primitive Christianity that had been definitively closed elsewhere. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, in its geographical and political isolation, managed to keep alive a Christian tradition that in many aspects remained closer to the Jewish origins of the faith than any other Christian church. This isolation was not a weakness, but a strength that allowed the preservation of texts and traditions that elsewhere were suppressed by the need for doctrinal uniformity. The Ethiopian apocalyptic vision, therefore, represents not a distortion of the original Christian message, but possibly one of the purest expressions of how the first followers of Christ understood the ultimate destiny of humanity. What makes this discovery even more fascinating is the striking contrast between the two apocalyptic visions. While the Apocalypse of John, with its multi-headed beasts, scarlet dragons, and prostitute cities, reflects a world in constant war between the forces of good and evil, the Ethiopian apocalypse presents a cosmos where even divine judgment is tempered by celestial compassion. This difference is not merely stylistic, but reveals fundamentally distinct conceptions about the nature of God, the purpose of judgment, and the destiny of creation. Have you ever wondered why these visions are so disparate? The answer lies in the political and theological circumstances that molded each of these traditions, revealing how temporal power can profoundly influence the interpretation of eternal truth. The difference between these two apocalypses becomes even more evident when we examine their respective historical contexts and the forces that shaped their interpretations. The Apocalypse of John, probably written during the persecutions of the Emperor Domitian at the end of the 1st century, carries with it all the urgency and anguish of a Christian community under siege. Its symbols speak directly to the fears and hopes of Christians who saw in the Roman Empire the incarnation of absolute evil, an apocalyptic beast that devoured the saints and profaned everything sacred. The language is combative, the images are violent, and the final resolution involves a cosmic war where Christ returns as a divine warrior to destroy the enemies of his people. This martial vision of the end times made perfect sense for a church struggling for survival in a hostile world, but when the Roman Empire itself converted to Christianity under Constantine, the interpretation of these apocalyptic symbols underwent a radical transformation. What was once a prophetic denunciation of imperial power became a tool of that same power, used to legitimize the political ambitions of a now Christian empire. The enemies of Rome came to be identified as the enemies of God, and the apocalypse became no longer a hope of liberation for the oppressed, but a threat directed against all those who dared to challenge the established order. In absolute contrast to this trajectory, the Ethiopian apocalyptic tradition developed in a completely different environment. Ethiopia was never conquered by Rome, never had its theology molded by the needs of imperial power, and never needed to adapt its faith to the demands of state politics. This isolation allowed the Ethiopian church to preserve a vision of Christianity that was both older and purer, less contaminated by the accommodations that characterized European Christendom. The Ethiopian apocalypse, based on texts like the Apocalypse of Peter, and influenced by mystical traditions of desert monasticism, presents a Christ who comes not as a conqueror, but as a celestial shepherd, leading his sheep through the valley of the shadow of death, not with a flaming sword, but with divine light and wisdom. This difference in perspective is also reflected in the way each tradition understands the nature of the final judgment. In the Apocalypse of John, the judgment is fundamentally punitive and definitive. The righteous are separated from the wicked in an eternal division that admits no appeal or subsequent mercy. The language is one of total war, where the complete victory of one side necessarily implies the total destruction of the other. In the Ethiopian apocalypse, divine judgment is understood more as a process of purification than as an act of vengeance. Even those who suffer punishment are not necessarily lost forever, and there is always the possibility of redemption and return to communion with the divine. This more merciful conception of the final judgment is not born of modern sentimentality, but of the deeply Jewish roots of Ethiopian Christianity. The Jewish apocalyptic tradition, from which both the Apocalypse of Peter and Ethiopian theology drank abundantly, always understood divine judgment as a means of correction and restoration of the cosmic order, not as an end in itself. The suffering of the wicked is real and severe, but it serves a pedagogical and purifying purpose, ultimately aiming at the reconciliation of all creation with its Creator. This holistic vision of redemption, which includes not only human beings but the entire cosmos, represents one of the most distinctive characteristics of the Ethiopian apocalyptic tradition, contrasting drastically with the irreconcilable dualism that marks the Apocalypse of John. The distinction between these two apocalyptic visions becomes even more pronounced when we examine their respective Christologies and the way each tradition understands the second coming of Christ. In the Apocalypse of John, Christ returns as the faithful and true, riding a white horse with eyes like a flame of fire and a sharp sword coming out of his mouth. This warrior image perfectly reflects the messianic expectations of a persecuted community that longed for divine vengeance against its oppressors. The Johannine Christ is a celestial military commander, coming to make war against the enemies of God and establish his kingdom through absolute force and the complete destruction of all opposition. In striking contrast, the Ethiopian apocalypse presents Christ primarily as a luminous shepherd, a figure of infinite compassion who guides his flock through the darkness of judgment, not with violence, but with the pure light of his divine presence. This difference is not merely aesthetic, but reveals fundamentally distinct conceptions about the nature of divine authority and the purpose of God's eschatological intervention in human history. While the Johannine Christ comes to conquer and subdue, the Ethiopian Christ comes to illuminate and redeem, even those who initially resist his light. This Christological divergence is also reflected in the way each tradition understands the role of violence in the divine plan of salvation. The Apocalypse of John is saturated with images of destruction and bloodshed, devastating plagues, rivers turning to blood, cities collapsing in flames, celestial armies massacring the enemies of God. This language of total war was understandable and even necessary in a context where Christians saw themselves as defenseless victims of a brutally violent, oppressive system. The promise of divine vengeance offered hope and consolation to those who had no other recourse but to await supernatural intervention. However, the Ethiopian tradition, developing in an environment where Christians were not a persecuted minority, but the majority population of an independent kingdom, was able to develop an apocalyptic theology less centered on violence and more focused on spiritual transformation. The fire that appears in the Ethiopian apocalypse is not primarily destructive but purifying. The tears shed in judgment are not only of terror and despair, but also of repentance and eventual reconciliation. Even the angels participate in this compassionate dimension of judgment, weeping along with the suffering sinners, demonstrating that heaven does not rejoice in the destruction of the wicked, but laments the necessity of their punishment. This more nuanced view of divine judgment allows for an understanding of celestial justice that transcends mere retribution. In the Ethiopian tradition, God's justice is not merely satisfied with the punishment of evil, but actively seeks the restoration of the original cosmic order. The ultimate goal is not the elimination of the wicked, but their transformation and eventual reintegration into the divine plan of universal harmony. This perspective, deeply rooted both in the Jewish apocalyptic tradition and in the monastic spirituality of the desert, offers a powerful alternative to the irreconcilable dualism that characterizes many Western interpretations of the end times. The influence of the monastic tradition on the Ethiopian apocalypse cannot be underestimated. The desert monks, with their direct experience of spiritual realities through contemplation and asceticism, developed an understanding of the divine nature that was both more intimate and more universal than that which emerged from the urban centers of ecclesiastical power. For these Christian mystics, God was not primarily a severe judge or a military commander, but the infinite source of love and compassion who tirelessly sought the salvation of all creation. This contemplative experience profoundly influenced the way the Ethiopian church interpreted the apocalyptic texts, resulting in a vision of the end times that was simultaneously more hopeful and deeper than its Western counterparts. The question of the canonicity of these alternative apocalyptic texts reveals some of the most fascinating and disturbing power dynamics of early Christian history. When we examine the processes by which certain books were included in the Bible while others were rejected, we discover that theological considerations were not always the determining factors. Politics, geography, and institutional alliances often played roles as important as, if not more important than, questions of doctrinal orthodoxy or apostolic authenticity. The Apocalypse of Peter, for example, was widely accepted and venerated by many early Christian communities, being considered as authoritative as any other text that would later enter the official canon. The exclusion of this and other alternative apocalyptic texts from the Western canon did not occur due to inherent deficiencies in their theological content, but due to the triumph of a particular ecclesiastical faction that managed to impose its vision as normative for all of Christendom. The Council of Carthage in 397, which helped finalize the Western biblical canon, was not an impartial assembly of scholars seeking divine truth, but a political meeting where bishops aligned with Rome consolidated their control over the official interpretation of the Christian faith. Texts that did not serve the interests of this dominant coalition were systematically marginalized and eventually lost to Western tradition. However, Ethiopia, due to its remote geographical location and political independence, managed to escape this forced uniformity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never submitted to Roman or Byzantine authority, never participated in the councils that defined the Western canon, and never allowed external political considerations to determine which texts were appropriate for its community of faith. As a result, Ethiopia became a unique repository of early Christian texts that had been suppressed or lost elsewhere. Its Bible includes not only the Apocalypse of Peter, but also the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and many other writings that preserve alternative perspectives on fundamental questions of faith and eschatology. This independent preservation of alternative apocalyptic texts has profound implications for our understanding of primitive Christianity. It suggests that the theological diversity that characterized the first centuries of the Christian faith was much greater than we generally recognize, and that many of the doctrines we consider essential to Orthodox Christianity may in fact be later developments that reflect the political needs of specific ecclesiastical institutions more than the original beliefs of the first followers of Christ. The Ethiopian Apocalypse, therefore, offers a window into a Christianity that may be closer to the historical origins of the faith than many traditions that claim greater antiquity or apostolic authority. The Ethiopian tradition also preserves a unique connection to the Jewish roots of Christianity that was largely lost in the Western tradition. The Ethiopian legend about the Ark of the Covenant, narrated in the Kebra Nagast, establishes a direct continuity between ancient Israel and the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia through the figure of Menelik, supposedly the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This narrative, although historically questionable, reveals the deep identification of the Ethiopian Church with the Hebrew biblical tradition and its understanding of itself as the legitimate heir of the divine promises made to God's chosen people. This Hebrew connection explains many of the distinctive characteristics of the Ethiopian apocalyptic tradition, including its canonical preservation of the Book of Enoch and its emphasis on themes such as cosmic purification and the final restoration of all creation. These perspectives, which were common in Jewish apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period, were largely abandoned by Western Christianity in favor of a more dualistic theology that emphasized the irreconcilable separation between the saved and the condemned. The Ethiopian tradition, however, kept alive this more holistic vision of redemption, thus offering a valuable alternative to the dominant interpretations of eschatological destiny. Ethiopian Christian art offers perhaps the most eloquent visual manifestation of this radical difference in apocalyptic perspective. While traditional Western Christian art typically represents the final judgment as a scene of terror and separation, Christ as an implacable judge, terrifying demons dragging souls to hell, the condemned in eternal agony, the Ethiopian artistic tradition presents a radically different vision of the last days. In the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela and the illuminated manuscripts of Ethiopian monasteries, the apocalypse is portrayed not as a cosmic catastrophe, but as a restoration of the original divine order, a final reconciliation between heaven and earth. These visual representations show the righteous crossing bridges of pure light, not fleeing from a world in flames, but being guided through celestial landscapes by angels whose expression is not one of implacable severity, but of infinite compassion. The scales of justice are held by archangels, whose faces reflect not the coldness of legal judgment, but the loving sadness of parents who must discipline beloved children. Even the apocalyptic fire is represented not as an instrument of destruction, but as a means of purification, its flames enveloping souls not to consume them, but to burn away only what prevents them from reaching the fullness of their original divine nature. This difference in visual representation reflects a fundamentally distinct theology about the nature of divine love and the purpose of the final judgment. In the Ethiopian tradition, God does not abandon his creation even at the hour of the most severe judgment. The suffering of the wicked is real, but it serves a redemptive purpose, ultimately aiming at the restoration of all creation to perfect communion with the Creator. This perspective, deeply rooted in the mystical traditions of Eastern Christianity and the contemplative experience of desert monasticism, offers a powerful alternative to the cold legalism that often characterizes Western interpretations of divine justice. The modern rediscovery of these Ethiopian apocalyptic texts has occurred in a context where Western scholars are finally beginning to question the traditional narratives about the origins of Christianity and to recognize the theological diversity that characterized the first Christian communities. For centuries, the dominant perspective in the West assumed that the biblical canon established by the councils of the 4th century represented a universal consensus of primitive Christians on which texts were truly apostolic and authoritative. Recent research, however, has demonstrated that this apparent uniformity was largely the result of political imposition and institutional suppression, not genuine theological agreement. The Ethiopian manuscripts, preserved in their African isolation, offer tangible evidence that alternative Christian traditions existed, maintaining radically different interpretations of fundamental questions such as the nature of Christ, the purpose of salvation, and the final destiny of humanity. These traditions were not heretical deviations from an established orthodoxy, but legitimate expressions of primitive Christian faith that simply followed different developmental trajectories from those that came to dominate the Western Mediterranean. Their preservation in Ethiopia, therefore, represents an invaluable contribution to our understanding of the true diversity of primitive Christianity. This reassessment has profound implications for contemporary Christian theology. If the apocalyptic visions preserved in the Ethiopian tradition represent equally valid perspectives on the end times, then many of the doctrines that Western Christianity considers essential and immutable may in fact be particular interpretations that reflect specific historical circumstances more than universal and eternal truths. The possibility of a more universal salvation, of a divine judgment tempered by compassion, and of a final reconciliation that includes all creation are not modern sentimental fantasies, but theological perspectives with deep roots in the oldest Christian tradition. The preservation of these alternative apocalyptic texts in the Ethiopian tradition confronts us with fundamental questions about authority, interpretation, and the nature of religious truth that resonate far beyond specialized academic circles. If the Ethiopian Church managed to keep alive a vision of Christianity that may be closer to the historical origins of the faith than many traditions that claim direct apostolic authority, then what implications does this have for our understanding of doctrinal continuity and institutional legitimacy? The answer to this question is not merely a matter of historical interest, but touches the very heart of what it means to be Christian in the contemporary world. The Ethiopian experience suggests that the true preservation of primitive Christian faith may have occurred not in the centers of ecclesiastical power traditionally associated with orthodoxy, but on the geographical and political margins of Christendom, where isolated communities were able to resist the uniformizing pressures that homogenized Christian theology elsewhere. This discovery should lead us to question our assumptions about where to seek authentic Christian truth, and to recognize that theological diversity may be an essential feature, not an accidental flaw, of the Christian faith in its purest form. The Ethiopian apocalyptic vision, with its emphasis on divine compassion, the possibility of universal redemption, and the final restoration of all creation, offers theological resources especially relevant to our current era, marked by ecological crises, global conflicts, and the growing awareness of the interconnectedness of all life on the planet. While traditional interpretations of the Apocalypse of John often feed escapist perspectives that see the destruction of the current world as necessary and even desirable, the Ethiopian apocalypse points to a more hopeful vision where the ultimate goal is not escape from material creation, but its transfiguration and sanctification. This difference in perspective has profound practical implications for how Christians approach contemporary issues of social justice, environmental stewardship, and interfaith relationships. An apocalyptic theology, based on the inevitable destruction of the current world, will naturally discourage efforts to improve earthly conditions or build bridges of understanding with other religious traditions. On the other hand, an apocalyptic vision centered on cosmic restoration and reconciliation will provide a solid theological basis for active engagement in transforming the current world in preparation for its eventual divine transfiguration. The Ethiopian tradition also preserves an understanding of time and history that transcends the linear categories that dominate modern Western thought. Instead of seeing the apocalypse as a single catastrophic event that will occur at some distant future point, the Ethiopian perspective understands the last days as a continuous cosmic process of purification and renewal that is already underway, and in which each generation of the faithful actively participates. This more dynamic and participatory vision of eschatology offers a valuable alternative both to passive fatalism and to the superficial optimism that characterize many contemporary approaches to the future of humanity. Finally, the preservation of these alternative apocalyptic texts in Ethiopia reminds us that Christian truth was never the exclusive property of any particular institution or tradition, but always found expression in a multiplicity of voices, each reflecting the unique experience of specific communities in their journey of faith. What Ethiopia preserved through the centuries was not merely an alternative version of the last days, but a living testimony that Christianity, in its deepest essence, has always embraced multiple perspectives, multiple paths, and multiple dreams about what the end times truly mean. In an era when many still fear the apocalyptic fire of divine wrath, the Ethiopian vision whispers something softer and deeper, that the end is not merely destruction, but a final call to return to original harmony, to divine light, and to the ancient truths written not only in sacred books, but in the very hearts of all creation that yearns for its final liberation and glorification.